Hey there folks, and welcome back to another last epic Alkalite build video where I'm trying to play all the Alkalite skills I can so I can make a decision as to what to play when the multiplayer patch finally hits, assuming there's no major patch that would screw all this up. Something has to live, right? Anyway, this has been good for me because I can get a much better understanding of how scaling works with other builds and such, so it's been fun while I try and figure out, all the different ways to play the Alkalite builds and how to scale stuff differently. Anyway, today's build is another solo minion build because Dreadshade is super OP. Today we're running Bone Nova Golem. And I tried really hard not just to do the Bone Nova Golem build because obviously it's been done before and I'm kind of late to that party, but I wanted to try to put my own spin on it. So I tried using like 2 golems, and then I tried using fire golems, ignite scaling, but then I kind of fell flat. So what I ended up settling on was just a little unique, and that is Bleed Bone Golem. I went with the bleed dots since bleed is physical and it scales off physical stuff, which Bone Nova is too. So while I was testing golems in general, I was actually surprised at how good bleed was, so I kind of leaned over to that way. Not that the damage numbers matter since this is a target dummy, but the point is that bleed dot is really good. Like, it's a 200k dot, so it's not insignificant like rogue poisons. And while obviously the Bone Nova does more damage than the dot itself, this dot performs a lot better than any of the other dot builds I've tried, and that way, if something gets out of range of Bone Nova, which has a very limited range, they're probably just going to die to the dot anyway. And as I was playing this Bone Golem build and leveling it up to 100, I quickly realized that this build is sitting on the fence of being one of, if not the best minion build, but it does have problems that are holding it back, and mostly, that's on 11th hour to fix. So let me quickly talk about the pros and cons of this build, and you'll get what I'm saying. Pros first. Golem scales insanely well. It gets tons of spell multiplicative modifiers, which scales Bone Nova. It can get dot multiplicative modifiers. It gets a lot of flat damage, which is a great way to scale in general since we have just generic damage scaling stuff, since we have stuff like just minion spell damage or minion physical damage for bleeds. And then you pair that with Bone Curse on golems, which gives you another like 150% fizz multiplier. And yeah, it just gets a lot of good scaling. You don't need much gear to get this build going, and there's tons of room to grow, which is great. I actually just finished a campaign playthrough leveling with this build. I'm going to make that kind of like my go-to Alkalite build to get through the campaign. The damage on Bone Nova is clearly just insane though. It just melts 350 plus bosses and maps. Tier 4 Julra is just like wet paper, so there's just no issue. So yeah, like this thing is not going to die. It's a low button build as well. You only need to use Blood Rip, and then obviously every now and then on a big enemy you drop Bone Curse and Dreadshade occasionally, like once every 40 seconds. Bone Golem also draws a lot of aggro in general, so despite it being a 1 minion build, enemies tend to focus on that more than you. All around though, solid build, one of the best I've played. But with that, let's get into the negatives. So the first thing is that the Golem AI is super bad. You hit A to have it attack an enemy, but it often just turns around to attack something behind you or hit a box or something, or it's constantly taking the worst paths to get to where you want it. It's lagging behind. It's just not the best. Golem can be really weird, but that's not a deal breaker for me. It might be for some people, in which case I would prefer the Abomination build. But next is that you cannot scale the radius of Bone Nova. Despite there being idols and armor affixes that increase Bone Nova speed, which should also increase its range, they don't work, and they should because Bone Golem is the only thing that really uses Bone Nova besides player sacrifice. So it makes no sense to have a modifier that only affects the player there when it's one of those double modifiers that has 2 effects, like one for the player, one for the minion. So the radius is incredibly tiny, and you have to chase the Bone Golem around to catch as much as you can, and knowing that it should be able to get bigger but can't right now is kind of a letdown. That being said, it could be potentially amazing in the future, like we could have full screen AoEs. Then the other problem we have is Rip Blood. So I'm using Rip Blood to proc the Bone Nova because using that with Harder Eukaros is one of the best ward generators right now, and it's amazing for our defenses. But when you take the gnome that lets you cast Rip Blood on minions, it's supposed to increase the health you get back from Rip Blood by 100%, but instead it cuts it in half of the original, so you can't actually sustain Heart of Eukaros anymore, and you just don't gain as much ward with it. So it's bug, big rip, it would be another potentially amazing thing that would get fixed. So we'll be able to swap out our boots and chests, which would be great. And then lastly, the other cons of this build, like the solo Abomination build, that there is one map modifier that royally blows for this guy: crit avoidance. Despite Dreadshade saying that your minion will always crit avoidance supersedes that, and in fact does not make you always crit. I get it, I'm not going to argue with it, it just sucks and it crushes all your damage for the build if you hit those modifiers on your echo, so be careful. That's also one of the reasons why I went with bleed though, is because we don't really care about the crits with bleed. Alright, so that's all for the pros and cons. Let me cover the gear, skills, and passives the best I can before we continue. So we're going to take a look at the gear now for the Bone Golem Retaliation build. So we're going to start with the staff, which is a horn staff for the +1 minion skills. Not super mandatory to be honest, but you know, if you can get one, great. This is only going to give us 1 more point in our golem. But you do want to get minion spell damage and minion physical damage, however you can. Cast speed, if you can craft it on with some extra forging potential, is also good, so you can cast Rip Blood faster. But the only sets that really matter are the suffixes for minion spell damage and minion physical damage. For the helmet, we're going with an adaptive spell damage helmet, the Profane Mask, because Bone Nova is a spell. And then with this, we're going to go obviously with +4 Bone Golem if you can get +4, +3 is fine if you get a level 6. And then we're just, you know, standard health int, and then if you can seal something else, great. I sealed some minion bleed, but it's not a big deal. The amulet, of course, is Death Rattle because we'll be critting all the time, so getting the extra crit multiplier is great. And then we have minion damage and minion health as our legendary potential modifiers. We're using the Exsanguinous and Last Steps of the Living combo here to get our award bubble, only because the Heart of Vukeros isn't really effective right now, which I explained. Basically, the reason why we're doing this is because Rip Blood, which we have to use the Marrow Drinker to cast it on our Bone Golem to allow him to actually draw out his Bone Novas. It's supposed to give us an additional 100% health generated from Blood Orbs, which sounds great because that means we can sustain our life better. But it's actually not the case. This is actually cutting the health gained in half rather than adding 100%. So we actually can't sustain our life regen through the Heart of Vukeros very well. So it doesn't really work out. So because of that, we're running, you know, these 2 pieces so we can just constantly have a bubble. And then with Arcane Fortress over here, we're at least getting some ward automatically. We're not converting it from like health loss to ward. So this way we can actually get, you see, a little bit more ward. So we can get, you know, 11k, 12k bubbles, which is nice. But that's the reason why we're using these. So for the Exsanguinous, I don't actually know if you really need a whole lot of legendary potential for this or any, because I'm using this to try and do like a bleed build for minions, and so I got some bleed effects on here. But honestly, the bleed's good, but it's not like amazing, so you don't have to do that at all. If you can just get the health on it, you'll be fine. Like if we come over here with the Golem hits really hard on his own. You know, he's getting up to like 700k, 800k damage hits or whatever. And the dot's nice. We can get, you know, a 200k dot, which ramps down, obviously. But the dot's really good, but I don't think it's super important. It's a nice dot, but you can probably just take that off and be fine. The rings, we are running 2 of these turquoise rings with just int, minion damage, health, crit strike avoidance. I sealed some poison res. Obviously, you don't need to do that, but pretty standard, just, you know, ring. For the belt, I have increased minion damage, increased minion health, crit strike avoidance, and hybrid health. Any of these mods can be whatever tiers, whatever you can get. It's not going to make that much of a difference one way or the other. Just try to get some minion damage and health on there. The gloves, we're using Jorah's Obsession, which I slapped on Armor Shred. There's not a whole lot of modifiers which are going to help our minions because we already crit 100% of the time and we don't need the cast speed like for the Abomination build. So Armor Shred's really the only thing that could help, and so Armor Shred is good, and we're getting a bunch of shreds, so you're easy to get 15 stacks. And because our Bone Nova and our bleed is physical damage, the Armor Shred does help a bit. Back to the Last Steps of Living. If you're unfamiliar with how these boots and armors work together, basically they both drain your life per second, but then give you percentage of your missing health as ward per second. So at 2 of these, we have 35% of our missing health as gained as ward per second. So we're running a fat chunk of ward per second. And then you just bring that up higher with increased ward retention rate. For the relic, pretty standard relic. We just have some minion damage and some int. So yeah, nothing super special there. Get some resistances or life if you can, but nothing super costly. For the idols, we're gonna have, you know, just health idols for the most part. So percent health, regular health, percent health, regular health. And then we do have a chance to apply Mark on Death because our Bone Nova will be able to apply Mark on Death. And that's it. Everything's just health, life, and some chance to apply Mark on Death. Alright, let's talk about our skills really quick. Obviously, we're going to be doing a Bone Golem build, so we're going to do Bone Golem. I tried to play around with some other Golem stuff, like doing Fire Golems, but that didn't really work out. Basically, the entire build is this left half of the tree here, so we get Spell Damage Multiplicative Modifier, which is huge because Bone Nova is a spell. Bone Hail, which increases our chance to, you know, cast Bone Nova and increases Bone Nova's damage. And then Betrayal, which is the entire build is linked around this, which is basically that we hit our Golem, and it gets triple the chance to apply Bone Nova. So we get an additional 25% here, and we get 15% from base. So it's a 120% chance to retaliate with Bone Nova. We don't necessarily need it above 100% chance, but Bone Hail also just gives us more multiplicative damage modifier for Bone Nova in general, so that's good. And then we have Flight of the Femurs so that they travel out further. And then we're coming over here to the right to get movement speed for our Golem. I came further and got increased fire damage and dot damage, because dot damage we're trying to do a bleed build, so you don't have to run this. I decided to, but you can take the points off here and then finish off movement speed here and here, so make your Golem a lot faster, which is going to make your mapping better. But you do also want the additional fire damage, because we're just scaling damage in general a lot through Bone Nova, you know, just Bone Nova multiplicative modifier, spell damage multiplicative modifier, and like our Golem's modifiers. So flat fire is fine, but that's the whole Golem essentially. If you don't have 25 Golem, again, if you're going to take a few points off, if you don't have the staff or, you know, a +4 Golem helmet, you can just get rid of these. Rip Blood. This was supposed to be a standard Heart of Hukaros Rip Blood, but since this Marrow Drinker is bugged right now, we actually came all the way over here to Arcane Fortress, as I was saying, and so we're actually getting just a little bit of ward rather than restore our health, since we're not using Heart of Hukaros, so that's fine. And for the most part, we're doing the same old thing where we want to stack the cast speed as much as we can so we can spam that as fast as possible. And then we get some increased health, which is going to be converted to ward. For Dreadshade, we're going to come over here to Lone Watcher so we can have the no health degen for our Golem. Have one shade, so this is like, you know, a single minion notable. And then we're going to get, you know, increased Grim Fate, so we get more damage from the Dreadshade itself, which is going to get added with Lingering Doom here. I went over to Dustcart to get Damned on hit, because again, I was trying to do more of a dot build. This isn't obviously necessary at all. You can take the points off this to finish off Lingering Doom if you want. And then we also come over here to Dying Coven. You'd think you don't want increased attack and cast speed because we're using Bone Nova Retaliation, but I mean, we had to get 2 points to come over here anyways, but I threw the third one in because if your Golem actually gets to an enemy and has to do like his ground pound, that stops him for a long period of time. So if you can make his attack speed quicker, then that helps him get through that animation so he moves on to the next target. And then of course we'll come over here to Lingering Doom to get some extra necrotic damage. And then the 2 points that make Dreadshade super overpowered, all for one, so we get, you know, 60% more damage multiplicative modifier and Egoism so that our Golem always crits, which is the core of this build. Dreadshade is absurd. Bone Nova. So Bone Nova, we're actually coming up here to get Cultist Fervor so we can come and get Merciless, which increases our minions' physical damage by 50%, which is a multiplicative modifier. And the physical damage is our Bone Nova and our bleeds. And then we're going to come over here to Stack Bones, which we don't really need the damage reflect, but reflects pretty good because that scales as well. But we need the 3 points to get Barbed Constructions so that the physical damage gets 200% increased effect on our Bone Golem. So it's 150% more physical damage, which is huge. This is why Bone Golem scales so hard with Bone Curse on. And then for the extra points, we came down here to get Sigil of Mortality to get some Marked for Death when we cast Bone Golem. Not super important since we have, you know, the idols that do Marked for Death, but this is just a guaranteed way to actually get Marked for Death. Like, there's not a whole lot that's actually going to help us do anything else. Like, you can come over here and get Bleed since we're a Bleed build, but this is using our stats, not our Golems, so that's not going to do anything. We could get, you know, again, more Bone Curse damage, but that doesn't help. We can get Brittle Bones, which would kill enemies instantly, and that would help for bosses, but that's about it. But I went over here just to get some more Marked for Death duration. And then we're using Transplant. Transplant, not really a huge deal. We're getting some pools of blood so we can step back in and get our life back, but that's just kind of whatever. We're really just using it for bone armor so we can get a fat chunk of armor when we use Transplant, and then also some more minion damage whenever we use Transplant, and that's basically it. So our armor being 300, when we Transplant we get 700. Not a huge bump, but you know, it's something. Alright, so for our trees here, for our passive skills. So again, I was trying to go for a more bleed focused build, so I kind of went really hard into Alkalite. We went 31 points, and I came down here to get Veins of Power. This increases our minion's physical damage, which is good, but it also increases bleed duration, so that's helping our damage there a lot too for the bleeds. You obviously don't need to run bleed build. You can take all these points off and just run 20 into Alkalite, and if you're leveling this build, I wouldn't go bleed. I would just go, you know, pure physical stuff. So we came over here also to the Lich to get Apocrypha, so we can get 5 points of that for some int. And then we got Serrated Bones for bleed chance and minion bleed chance. So obviously we're trying to do a bleed build here. And Desolation for increased damage over time. Necromancer. We're coming over here to raise an army so we can get increased attack, cast speed, and damage. Again, the attack speed does kind of matter because we want to make sure our Golem can get through his ground pound animation quicker if he gets to an enemy. And then we're going to come over to Cursed Bloods. We didn't actually finish this off because it's actually not a huge bump. So we're going here to Life, because Minion Life. Aegis Vault, because Armor Shred's really, really good. None of this stuff really does anything. Unearthed Arms does do obviously damage for us because we get physical damage per point, but it's only 5%. It's not a big deal. If you don't want to run like the dot nodes and stuff, then you can finish off your physical damage here from Cursed Bloods and Unearthed Arms instead. But again, I was trying to Fizz Bleed. And we're going to come over here to Frantic Summons because we want, again, more attack and cast speed. Again, this only matters because we want our golems to actually get through his little ground pound animation. And then we're going to come up here to River of Bones so he can leech on crit, which we're always going to crit. And we're going to get 3 points into Heresy. We don't need the critical strike chance, we just kind of want some intelligence. And then we're going to do Blades of the Forlorn because crit multiplier is huge since we always crit. And then we got Moonlight Pyre, so we have just 20 flat added elemental damage, which is, just great to scale with all our generic scaling for Bone Nova. And that's basically everything we got. There's not a whole lot here that's going to help us otherwise, so that's all our passive skills. Alright, I'd love to change some stuff around if Rip Blood ever gets fixed, but for now, that's what I'm working with. And I'm pushing into the 400 plus corruptions with this guy easy, so I can't wait for that when it comes multiplayer time. So I already talked about the things I tried that didn't really pan out for this build, like the other types of golems, but let me discuss a different topic. We're going to compare Bone Golem to the Abomination as they're both solo minion builds. Each build plays pretty much identical, you just carry around one big minion and spam Rip Blood. The main difference is how the build feels. Abomination definitely takes more gear to get going as it doesn't quite scale as well as Bone Golem, and you really do want the extra points from tier 6 or tier 7 Abomination relics. Plus you need a Heart of Ukero, so trying to get that with an Abomination roll can be a bit RNG heavy, I'm sure. So yeah, there's issues there. But Abomination also definitely has better AI and feels better to take around a map. But the Bone Golem definitely hits more consistently, and it's stronger, and it clears tight groups better than the Abomination can. Despite that, the Abomination can feel better for mapping since the Golem AI really bogs it down. Golem gets the win for bosses easily though, like it just crushes stuff, especially with the bleed dot. And I guess it depends on what gear drops for you is what you should pick up. I only started the Abomination build anyway because I slapped the Heart of Eukeros and happened to get the Abomination roll. I wasn't really thinking much of it. But if you can get it, I'd say Abomination feels better. Otherwise, Bone Golem is definitely easier to set up and has potential to be much stronger in the future, so that's probably a safer bet. So each build does have their pros and cons. I think the Golem build obviously is just a little bit better. It's just the AI really sucks. Abomination is definitely more stylish though, for sure. But that's basically all for me. I love the Bone Golem build more than I thought I would, and it's definitely going to be my number 2 spot for Alkalite builds, just under Flame Wraiths right now. Flame Wraiths are just absurd. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and thank you to my Patreon members. I appreciate you guys a whole lot. If you want to support me, that would be appreciated as well. Otherwise, if you just want to talk shop, chat, discuss games, whatever, I have a Discord link in the description below. But thanks, and good luck out there, folks.